Chapter 6 of Mrs. Skaggs's Husbands and Other Stories by Bret Harte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Romance of Madrono Hollow. The latch on the garden gate of the Follinsby Ranch clicked twice. The gate itself was so much in shadow that lovely night that old man Follinsby, sitting on his porch, could distinguish nothing but a tall white hat, and beside it a few fluttering ribbons, under the pines that marked the entrance. Whether because of this fact, or that he considered a sufficient time had elapsed since the clicking of the latch for more positive disclosure, I do not know. But after a few moments' hesitation he quietly laid aside his pipe, and walked slowly down the winding path toward the gate. At the ceanothus hedge he stopped and listened. There was not much to hear. The hat was saying to the ribbons that it was a fine night, and remarking generally upon the clear outline of the Sierras against the blue-black sky. The ribbons, it so appeared, had admired this all the way home, and asked the hat if it had ever seen anything half so lovely as the moonlight on the summit. The hat never had. It recalled some lovely nights in the South in Alabama. In the South of Alabama, was the way the man heard it. But then there were other things that made this night seem so pleasant. The ribbons could not possibly conceive what the hat could be thinking about. At this point there was a pause, of which Mr. Follinsby availed himself to walk very grimly and craunchingly down the gravel walk toward the gate. Then the hat was lifted and disappeared in the shadow, and Mr. Follinsby confronted only the half foolish, half mischievous, but wholly pretty face of his daughter. It was afterward known to Madrono Hollow that sharp words passed between Miss Jo and the old man, and that the latter coupled the names of one Culpepper Starbottle and his uncle, Colonel Starbottle, with certain uncomplimentary epithets, and that Miss Jo retaliated sharply. "Her father's blood before her father's face boiled up, and proved her truly of his race," quoted the blacksmith, who leaned toward the noble verse of Byron. "She saw the old man's bluff and raised him," was the director comment of the college-bred masters. Meanwhile, the subject of these animadversions proceeded slowly along the road to a point where the Follinsby mansion came in view. A long, narrow, white building, unpretentious yet superior to its neighbors, and bearing some evidences of taste and refinement in the vines that clambered over its porch, in its French windows, and the white muslin curtains that kept out the fierce California sun by day, and were now touched with silver in the gracious moonlight. Culpepper leaned against the low fence, and gazed long and earnestly at the building. Then the moonlight vanished ghostlike from one of the windows, a material glow took its place, and a girlish figure, holding a candle, drew the white curtains together. To Culpepper it was a Vestal Virgin standing before a hallowed shrine. To the prosaic observer I fear it was only a fair-haired young woman, whose wicked black eyes still shone with unfilial warmth. Howbeit, when the figure had disappeared, he stepped out briskly into the moonlight of the high road. Here he took off his distinguishing hat to wipe his forehead, and the moon shone full upon his face. It was not an unprepossessing one, albeit a trifle too thin and lank and bilious to be altogether pleasant. The cheekbones were prominent, and the black eyes sunken in their orbits. Straight black hair fell slantwise off a high but narrow forehead, and swept part of a hollow cheek. A long black mustache followed the perpendicular curves of his mouth. It was on the whole a serious, even quixotic face, but at times it was relieved by a rare smile of such tender and even pathetic sweetness that Miss Jo is reported to have said that, if it would only last through the ceremony, she would have married its possessor on the spot. "I once told him so," added that shameless young woman, "but the man instantly fell into a settled melancholy, and hasn't smiled since." A half mile below the Follinsby Ranch the white road dipped and was crossed by a trail that ran through Madrono Hollow. Perhaps because it was a near cut off to the settlement, perhaps from some less practical reason, Culpepper took this trail, and in a few moments stood among the rarely beautiful pines that give their name to the valley. Even in that uncertain light the weird beauty of the harlequin masqueraders was apparent. Their red trunks, a blush in the moonlight, a deep blood stain in the shadow, stood out against the silvery green foliage. It was as if nature in some gracious moment had here caught and crystallized the gypsy memories of the transplanted Spaniard, to cheer him in his lonely exile. As Culpepper entered the grove he heard loud voices. As he turned toward a clump of trees, a figure so bizarre and characteristic that it might have been a resident Daphne, a figure overdressed in crimson silk and lace, with bare brown arms and shoulders, and a wreath of honeysuckle, stepped out of the shadow. It was followed by a man. Culpepper started. To come to the point briefly, he recognized in the man the features of his respected uncle, Colonel Starbottle; in the female, a lady who may be briefly described as one possessing absolutely no claim to an introduction to the polite reader. To hurry over equally unpleasant details, both were evidently under the influence of liquor. From the excited conversation that ensued, Culpepper gathered that some insult had been put upon the lady at a public ball which she had attended that evening, and that the Colonel, her escort, had failed to resent it with the sanguinary completeness that she desired. I regret that even in a liberal age I may not record the exact and even picturesque language in which this was conveyed to her hearers. Enough that at the close of a fiery peroration, with feminine inconsistency she flew at the gallant Colonel, and would have visited her delayed vengeance upon his luckless head, but for the prompt interference of Culpepper. Thwarted in this, she threw herself upon the ground, and then into unpicturesque hysterics. There was a fine moral lesson, not only in this grotesque performance of a sex which cannot afford to be grotesque, but in the ludicrous concern with which it inspired the two men. Culpepper, to whom woman was more or less angelic, was pained and sympathetic. The Colonel, to whom she was more or less improper, was exceedingly terrified and embarrassed. Howbeit, the storm was soon over, and after Mistress Dolores had returned a little dagger to its sheath, her garter, she quietly took herself out of Madrono Hollow, and happily out of these pages forever. These two men, left to themselves, conversed in low tones. Dawn stole upon them before they separated. The Colonel quite sobered and in full possession of his usual jaunty self-assertion; Culpepper with a baleful glow in his hollow cheek, and in his dark eyes a rising fire. The next morning the general ear of Madrono Hollow was filled with rumors of the Colonel's mishap. It was asserted that he had been invited to withdraw his female companion from the floor of the Assembly Hall at the Independence Hotel, and that, failing to do this, both were expelled. It is to be regretted that in 1854 public opinion was divided in regard to the propriety of this step, and that there was some discussion as to the comparative virtue of the ladies who were not expelled. But it was generally conceded that the real casus belli was political. "Is this a dashed Puritan meeting?" had asked the Colonel savagely. "It's no Pike County shindig," had responded the floor manager cheerfully. "You're a Yank," had screamed the Colonel, profanely qualifying the noun. "Get, you border ruffian," was the reply. Such, at least, was the substance of the reports. As, at that sincere epoch, expressions like the above were usually followed by prompt action, a fracas was confidently looked for. Nothing, however, occurred. Colonel Starbottle made his appearance next day upon the streets with somewhat of his usual pomposity, a little restrained by the presence of his nephew, who accompanied him and who, as a universal favorite, also exercised some restraint upon the curious and impertinent. But Culpepper's face wore a look of anxiety quite at variance with his usual grave repose. "The Don don't seem to take the old man's set back kindly," observed the sympathizing blacksmith. "Perhaps he was sweet on Dolores himself," suggested the skeptical expressman. It was a bright morning, a week after this occurrence, that Miss Jo Folinsbee stepped from her garden into the road. This time the latch did not click as she cautiously closed the gate behind her. After a moment's irresolution, which would have been awkward but that it was charmingly employed, after the manner of her sex, in adjusting a bow under a dimpled but rather prominent chin, and in pulling down the fingers of a neatly fitting glove, she tripped toward the settlement. Small wonder that a passing teamster drove his 6 mules into the wayside ditch and imperiled his load to keep the dust from her spotless garments. Small wonder that the Lightning Express withheld its speed and flashed to let her pass, and that the expressman, who had never been known to exchange more than rapid monosyllables with his fellow man, gazed after her with breathless admiration, for she was certainly attractive. In a country where the ornamental sex followed the example of youthful nature, and were prone to overdress and glaring effervescence, Miss Jo's simple and tasteful raiment added much to the physical charm of, if it did not actually suggest a sentiment to, her presence. It is said that Euchre Deck Billy, working in the gulch at the crossing, never saw Miss Folinsbee pass but that he always remarked apologetically to his partner that he believed he must write a letter home. Even Bill Masters, who saw her in Paris presented to the favorable criticism of that most fastidious man, the late Emperor, said that she was stunning, but a big discount on what she was at Madrono Hollow. It was still early morning, but the sun, with California extravagance, had already begun to beat hotly on the little chip hat and blue ribbons, and Miss Jo was obliged to seek the shade of a bypath. Here she received the timid advances of a vagabond yellow dog graciously, until, emboldened by his success, he insisted upon accompanying her, and, becoming slobberingly demonstrative, threatened her spotless skirt with his dusty paws, when she drove him from her with some slight acerbity, and a stone which happily fell within 50 feet of its destined mark. Having thus proved her ability to defend herself, with characteristic inconsistency, she took a small panic, and gathering her white skirts in one hand and holding the brim of her hat over her eyes with the other, she ran swiftly at least 100 yards before she stopped. Then she began picking some ferns and a few wild flowers still spared to the withered fields, and then a sudden distrust of her small ankles seized her, and she inspected them narrowly for those burrs and bugs and snakes which are supposed to lie in wait for helpless womanhood. Then she plucked some golden heads of wild oats, and with a sudden inspiration placed them in her black hair, and then came quite unconsciously upon the trail leading to Madrono Hollow. Here she hesitated. Before her ran the little trail, vanishing at last into the bosky depths below. The sun was very hot. She must be very far from home. Why should she not rest a while under the shade of a madrono? She answered these questions by going there at once. After thoroughly exploring the grove, and satisfying herself that it contained no other living human creature, She sat down under one of the largest trees, with a satisfactory little sigh. Miss Jo loved the Madrono. It was a cleanly tree. No dust ever lay upon its varnished leaves. Its immaculate shade never was known to harbor grub or insect. She looked up at the rosy arms interlocked and arched above her head. She looked down at the delicate ferns and cryptograms at her feet. Something glittered at the root of the tree. She picked it up. It was a bracelet. She examined it carefully for cipher or inscription. There was none. She could not resist a natural desire to clasp it on her arm and to survey it from that advantageous viewpoint. This absorbed her attention for some moments, and when she looked up again she beheld at a little distance Culpepper Starbottle. He was standing where he had halted, with instinctive delicacy, on first discovering her. Indeed, he had even deliberated whether he ought not to go away without disturbing her. But some fascination held him to the spot. Wonderful power of humanity! Far beyond jutted an outlying spur of the Sierra, vast, compact, and silent. Scarcely 100 yards away, a league-long chasm dropped its sheer walls of granite 1,000 feet. On every side rose up the serried ranks of pine trees, in whose close-set files centuries of storm and change had wrought no breach. Yet all this seemed to Culpepper to have been planned by an all-wise Providence as the natural background to the figure of a pretty girl in a yellow dress. Although Miss Jo had confidently expected to meet Culpepper somewhere in her ramble, now that he came upon her suddenly, she felt disappointed and embarrassed. His manner, too, was more than usually grave and serious, and more than ever seemed to jar upon that audacious levity which was this giddy girl's power and security in a society where all feeling was dangerous. As he approached her, she rose to her feet, but almost before she knew it, he had taken her hand and drawn her to a seat beside him. This was not what Miss Jo had expected, but nothing is so difficult to predicate as the exact preliminaries of a declaration of love. What did Culpepper say? Nothing, I fear, that will add anything to the wisdom of the reader. Nothing, I fear, that Miss Jo had not heard substantially from other lips before. But there was a certain conviction, fire speed, and fury in the manner that was deliciously novel to the young lady. It was certainly something to be courted in the 19th century with all the passion and extravagance of the 16th. It was something to hear, amid the slang of a frontier society, the language of knight-errantry poured into her ear by this lantern-jawed, dark-browed descendant of the Cavaliers. I do not know that there was anything more in it. The facts, however, go to show that at a certain point Miss Jo dropped her glove, and that in recovering it Culpepper possessed himself first of her hand and then her lips. When they stood up to go, Culpepper had his arm around her waist, and her black hair, with its sheaf of golden oats, rested against the breast pocket of his coat. But even then I do not think her fancy was entirely captive. She took a certain satisfaction in this demonstration of Culpepper's splendid height, and mentally compared it with a former flame, one Lieutenant McMurk, an active but undersized Hector, who subsequently fell a victim to the incautiously composed and monotonous beverages of a frontier garrison. Nor was she so much preoccupied but that her quick eyes, even while absorbing Culpepper's glances, were yet able to detect, at a distance, the figure of a man approaching. In an instant she slipped out of Culpepper's arm, and whipping her hands behind her, said, "There's that horrid man!" Culpepper looked up and beheld his respected uncle panting and blowing over the hill. His brow contracted as he turned to Miss Jo. "You don't like my uncle?" "I hate him." Miss Jo was recovering her ready tongue. Culpepper blushed. He would have liked to enter upon some details of the Colonel's pedigree and exploits, but there was not time. He only smiled sadly. The smile melted Miss Jo. She held out her hand quickly, and said with even more than her usual effrontery, "Don't let that man get you into any trouble. Take care of yourself, dear, and don't let anything happen to you." Miss Jo intended this speech to be pathetic. The tenure of life among her lovers had hitherto been very uncertain. Culpepper turned toward her, but she had already vanished in the thicket. The Colonel came up panting.
"I've looked all over town for you, and be dashed to you, sir. Who was that with you?"
"A lady." Culpepper never lied, but he was discreet.
"Damn 'em all! Look here, Culp. I spotted the man who gave the order to pull me off the floe."
"Flow" was what the Colonel said.
"The other night."
"Who was it?" asked Culpepper listlessly.
"Jack Follinsby."
"Who?"
"Why, the son of that dashed nigger-worshipping, psalm-singing Puritan Yankee. What's the matter now? Look here, Culp. You ain't going back on your blood, are you? You ain't going back on your word? You ain't going down at the feet of this trash like a whipped hound?"
Culpepper was silent. He was very white. Presently he looked up and said quietly, "No." Culpepper Starbottle had challenged Jack Follinsby, and the challenge was accepted. The cause alleged was the expelling of Culpepper's uncle from the floor of the Assembly Hall by the order of Follinsby. This much Madrono Hollow knew and could swear to, but there were other strange rumors afloat, of which the blacksmith was an able expounder.
"You see, gentlemen,"
he said to the crowd gathered round his anvil,
"I ain't got no theory of this affair. I only give a few facts as have come to my knowledge. Culpepper and Jack meets quite accidental like in Bob's saloon. Jack goes up to Culpepper and says, 'A word with you.' Culpepper bows and steps aside in this way, Jack standing about here."
The blacksmith demonstrates the position of the parties with two old horseshoes on the anvil.
"Jack pulls a bracelet from his pocket and says, 'Do you know that bracelet?' Culpepper says, 'I do not,' quite cool like and easy. Jack says, 'You gave it to my sister.' Culpepper says, still cool as you please, 'I did not.' Jack says, 'You lie, goddamn you,' and draws his derringer. Culpepper jumps forward about here,"
reference is made to the diagram,
"and Jack fires. Nobody hit. It's a mighty curious thing, gentlemen,"
continued the blacksmith, dropping suddenly into the abstract, and leaning meditatively on his anvil.
"It's a mighty curious thing that nobody gets hit so often. You and me empties our revolvers sociably at each other over a little game, and the room full and nobody gets hit. That's what gets me."
"Never mind, Thompson," chimed in Bill Masters.
"There's another and better world where we shall know all that and become better shots. Go on with your story." "Well, some grabs Culpepper and some grabs Jack, and so separates them. Then Jack tells 'em as how he had seen his sister wear a bracelet which he knew was one that had been given to Dolores by Colonel Starbottle. That Miss Jo wouldn't say where she got it, but owned up to having seen Culpepper that day. Then, the most curious thing of it yet, what does Culpepper do but rise up and takes all back that he said, and allows that he did give her the bracelet. Now, my opinion, gentlemen, is that he lied. It ain't like that man to give a gal that he respects anything off of that piece Dolores. But it's all the same now, and there's nothing but one thing to be done."
The way this one thing was done belongs to the record of Madrono Hollow. The morning was bright and clear, the air was slightly chill, but that was from the mist which arose along the banks of the river. As early as 6 o'clock the designated ground, a little opening in the Madrono grove, was occupied by Culpepper Starbottle, Colonel Starbottle, his second, and the surgeon. The colonel was exalted and excited, albeit in a rather imposing, dignified way, and pointed out to the surgeon the excellence of the ground, which at that hour was wholly shaded from the sun, whose steady stare is more or less discomposing to your duelist. The surgeon threw himself on the grass and smoked his cigar. Culpepper, quiet and thoughtful, leaned against a tree and gazed up the river. There was a strange suggestion of a picnic about the group, which was heightened when the colonel drew a bottle from his coat tails, and taking a preliminary draught, offered it to the others.
"Cocktail, sir," he explained with dignified precision. "A gentleman, sir, should never go out without 'em. Keeps off the morning chill. I remember going out in '53 with Hank Boompirater. Good catch, sir. The man had to put on his overcoat, and was shot in it. Fact."
But the noise of wheels drowned the colonel's reminiscences, and a rapidly driven buggy, containing Jack Folinsbee, Calhoun Bungstarter, his second, and Bill Masters, drew up on the ground. Jack Folinsbee leaped out gaily. "I had the jolliest work to get away without the governor's hearing," he began, addressing the group before him with the greatest volubility. Calhoun Bungstarter touched his arm, and the young man blushed. It was his first duel. "If you are ready, gentlemen," said Mr. Bungstarter, "we had better proceed to business. I believe it is understood that no apology will be offered or accepted. We may as well settle preliminaries at once, or I fear we shall be interrupted. There is a rumor in town that the Vigilance Committee are seeking our friends the Starbottles, and I believe, as their fellow countryman, I have the honor to be included in their warrant." At this probability of interruption, that gravity which had hitherto been wanting fell upon the group. The preliminaries were soon arranged, and the principals placed in position. Then there was a silence. To a spectator from the hill, impressed with the picnic suggestion, what might have been the popping of two champagne corks broke the stillness. Culpepper had fired in the air. Colonel Starbottle uttered a low curse. Jack Folinsbee sulkily demanded another shot. Again the parties stood opposed to each other. Again the word was given, and what seemed to be the simultaneous report of both pistols rose upon the air. But after an interval of a few seconds all were surprised to see Culpepper slowly raise his unexploded weapon and fire it harmlessly above his head. Then, throwing the pistol upon the ground, he walked to a tree and leaned silently against it. Jack Folinsbee flew into a paroxysm of fury. Colonel Starbottle raved and swore. Mr. Bungstarter was properly shocked at their conduct. "Really, gentlemen, if Mr. Culpepper Starbottle declines another shot, I do not see how we can proceed." But the Colonel's blood was up, and Jack Folinsbee was equally implacable. A hurried consultation ensued, which ended by Colonel Starbottle taking his nephew's place as principal, Bill Masters acting as second, vice Mr. Bungstarter, who declined all further connection with the affair. Two distinct reports rang through the hollow. Jack Folinsbee dropped his smoking pistol, took a step forward, and then dropped heavily upon his face. In a moment the surgeon was at his side. The confusion was heightened by the trampling of hoofs, and the voice of the blacksmith bidding them flee for their lives before the coming storm. A moment more and the ground was cleared, and the surgeon, looking up, beheld only the white face of Culpepper bending over him. "Can you save him?" "I cannot say. Hold up his head a moment while I run to the buggy." Culpepper passed his arm tenderly around the neck of the insensible man. Presently the surgeon returned with some stimulants. "There, that will do. Mr. Starbottle, thank you. Now, my advice is to get away from here while you can. I'll look after Folinsbee. Do you hear?" Culpepper's arm was still round the neck of his late foe, but his head had dropped and fallen on the wounded man's shoulder. The surgeon looked down, and catching sight of his face, stooped and lifted him gently in his arms. He opened his coat and waistcoat. There was blood upon his shirt, and a bullet hole in his breast. He had been shot unto death at the first fire. End of chapter 6.